What if you had spent your entire high school career learning how to write essays on the computer, and then you arrive in college, and the first thing that you have to do in arriving and sitting for your placement exams your freshman year to take a writing test, and that writing test is administered to you on paper? That's a conversation that we're going to be having in today's episode of AI in the Classroom Daily. But the case that I just described is actually something that I learned about back in 2001. I had just joined the Tufts Department of Education, Tufts University, and we had a new president, Larry Bacow, and he was coming around introducing himself, and he had just been the chancellor at MIT. And he was telling us a story about the learnings that MIT had made from their incoming writing exam, because they had done exactly what I just described. They had seen writing scores dipping, and they couldn't figure out what the cause of this was. This was in the late 1990s, around the year 2000. And they realized that all of their incoming students, this being MIT, were very native to the digital medium, and that was the way that they had learned how to do their writing. And it wasn't until MIT moved their placement test to be a writing test administered digitally that the scores immediately popped up right back where they had been in previous years. And it wasn't because the incoming class were any less accomplished as writers, but it was simply that they were being assessed in a medium that was very unfamiliar to them. Now, this is on my mind because a lot of the conversation around AI in schools has been centered on plagiarism when it comes to writing and ownership, authenticity of the product that you are creating. And we were talking yesterday in the episode from over the weekend about Science Leadership Academy and a blog post by Chris Lehman, the principal and founder of Science Leadership Academy. And he was talking about how we could chart a way forward in these uncertain times. And I wanted to take that question about what to do next and apply it to the use case of writing and what to do in these uncertain times when it comes to handwriting versus typing. And part of the punchline here is that transparency is really the best way forward. That's my takeaway from what Chris was writing, and I think that's the policy that is in place at Science Leadership Academy. And I wanted to explore the issue a little bit more deeply through the lens of research. And so, in the spirit of transparency, let me tell you what I did. First, I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, co-founder, chief academic officer at Newsella. I spend my time thinking about, writing about, talking about issues related to AI and its impact on teaching and the craft of teaching and how to advance that craft in this age. So what I did was I said to Claude, which I've been learning to use much more recently, what does the research say would happen if you decided in your middle school to no longer have students write digitally, but only write on paper? According to the research that's available, what would the effect be? And how would we understand what that effect is? And Claude went about pulling together an overview of research and outlining what's known about the impact of handwriting versus what's known about the impact of typing. Came up with a bunch of resources, assembled a deck for me, which I, of course, have reviewed. And I've also reviewed each of the resources, each of the cited pieces of research. And that's going to be in the last slide here. This will be available in the show notes if you want to go read any of these articles. So let's get into this question. This is what Chris was saying. 3 years after GPT, AI in schools isn't going well. The administrators that he knows and he himself report a clear rise in AI-powered cheating. And this is confounding because there's great promise, but there's also a great threat. And Chris's point is that we have to talk about this openly. And that's the way through this period is the transparency everyone becomes responsible for. When can GPT or any AI be used in an assignment? As the teacher, I set those guidelines. And as a student, when have I used it and how have I used it? When it comes to writing, you could think in very stark terms across two camps. On the one hand, this is Chris's sort of characterization of the promise of AI. And on the other, there's a kind of a return to the blue book. What Larry Bacow was describing was the impact on the student writing performance when you shift the medium and students who had been raised digitally were asked to go back to the blue book. And Chris's point, and this is the point I want to echo here, and I want to look into what the research says, is that the third way is the way forward, and that's through transparency. If you want to prevent AI-generated work, you could do this. And some of the research that Claude pulled together. And these are in the early days of GPT, but I think there's still a good number of districts, schools, classrooms where students are asked to write purely by hand, and they're using the sort of blue book method. So what happens when we go in that direction? Here are a couple of things that the research says about the strengths of handwriting. One, it creates a connectivity, as the research shows here, between motor, visual, sensory, and memory regions that you don't get from typing. So as you're transcribing manually, you are processing and you are encoding in your memory in a much stronger way the content that you are writing about than you are when you are typing. And this is one of the findings that underscores why note-taking is often more effective when you're taking notes by hand than if you're typing, because you actually have to process. You have to go through that processing act, and that forces you to encode and thereby retain and move from short-term to long-term memory. The interesting thing here, I think, is this last point, that there's benefits for this learning and retention, but not for composition. And sometimes when we talk about writing, we talk about it as though it's one thing, and whenever you write, it's the same purpose. And what the research is saying here is that there's a distinction in the purposes that you want to use for writing. Here's a sort of a comparison here of what it means to handwrite an essay and what it means to type an essay. And one of the things that really resonated for me as I was looking at this is that this very much echoes my essay writing process, that I'm a very different writer when I write on paper with pen than I am when I'm typing. I am able to much more easily revise, reorganize. I can get material down on paper and then I can shuffle it around. I tend to also be able to write longer papers much more easily. And then when I have to cut them back, I can do that revision. But I think what you'll see on the left is there are some constraints to the act of handwriting. So it may be an authentic product that I'm creating, and there's no danger that I'm going to use GPT, but I'm severely limited in terms of the normal motions I would go through as a writer if I'm only able to use pen and paper. So this is the answer that Claude is giving me to this predicted effects question, that likely we will get shorter, less developed work. There will be some kind of a trade-off between the handwriting speed and the thinking skill, where if I'm better at handwriting, and I frankly am not, I'm going to be able to move faster, whereas my counterpart, my peers, who's a better handwriter, is going to be able to generate more text than I am, and I'm going to be struggling to make my letters legible. And this is the kind of motor difficulty that's described in the research. And that what the conclusion here that Claude is proposing is that's introducing a different kind of friction that might not be helpful. And then when it comes to accommodations for writers who are not as able to manipulate pen and paper, if you're no longer going to allow for digital accommodation, then you're going to create barriers that had previously been solved for by things like speech to text. And so there's an added consideration. And this is an overview of some of the concerns around equity, where you have students who otherwise would have great difficulty writing on paper who are served by some of the digital accommodations, also with English language learners and neurodiverse learners. And so I think you have this dichotomy here of what it's solving for and what it's not solving for. And I think one of the things that we're all challenged by is, and this is true of reading as well, is it's true that there are aspects of, let's say, writing for note-taking purpose, for encoding and retaining for the longer term some of the knowledge of the content and the background knowledge and so forth of the material that you're digesting. But that's not without a trade-off. And you have to really be thinking carefully about how you want to position the writing and what kind of enablement you want to give to students to put their thoughts out in a composition versus a note-taking format. So the better path here, what Chris is arguing for, and I want to underscore, is that this is really about transparency. This is not a case where we can effectively lock this process down and go back to blue books. There's a great price to be paid for that. I think I would argue greater than the challenges around AI, because of course AI exists in the world around students. It's ever present, just as the internet has been ever present. Devices are ever present. And we're going to fight a losing battle if we try to restrict and play whack-a-mole with the number of policies we put in place that attempt to enforce a reality that is very restrictive inside the classroom that runs counter to the reality outside the classroom. So This is the policy a brief summary of the policy in effect at Science Leadership Academy. And I think it's a very concrete applied solution to the question of what does it mean to be transparent and how would you do this? So I let you dive into this further, but is to say this is not an abstract solution. SLA is showing that there is a way to proceed, however hazardous and challenging it may be. It's a much more sustainable, humane solution than the sort of blocking out of the thing that's challenging, that is removing access to the technology if technology is going to be a challenge. What SLA is reinforcing here is that this is a process of a dialogue. And I think that dialogue has probably been undermined and the trust has been broken a number of times by students unknowingly perhaps or willfully using the technology to circumvent the intent of the assignment and the alignment that the teacher is working towards with the effort that they want their students to put in towards the learning objective, and the student using the AI to subvert that intention and subvert that alignment and really do an end run around the assignment. And so this is an ongoing conversation, obviously, but I think it's one that's very pressing because it's showing how the policy reaction to AI and to the emergence of AI into the classroom can actually work against the learning and the common objectives of teachers as they're working with students. So here are the references that I mentioned. I'd be very interested if you are working in a middle school and you are seeing this research play out, or you're seeing it play out, the reality play out in a different way. I'd love to know what you think. If you write in the comments here and share a little bit of the context, what here resonates for you and where would you draw some exceptions to the conclusions that I'm suggesting are implicated by the research and what Chris is pointing to in his practices. Thanks for joining. More next time.